I don't object to people finding ways of paying less tax. I think it's a jolly good idea to pay less tax if you can do it legally. We can't all do it, but those who can, good luck to them.
If you're rich, or if you're a large corporation, you can afford to hire an army of accountants and lawyers to help you legally avoid paying tax. A popular method is to keep all of your money and assets in a tax haven.
What is a tax haven? There are two key issues: low tax rates on profits and financial secrecy. And it's the second issue, financial secrecy, that's the real problem, because that allows businesses to shift profits around and wealthy individuals to hide assets from the taxman.
I have estimated the losses to the UK from tax avoidance and tax evasion. I believe that tax evasion costs us £70 billion a year. Now, that is roughly 2/3 of the budget of the NHS. Tax evasion, remember, is illegal activity, breaking the law. Tax avoidance is smaller. I estimate it's 25 billion. The important question, how much of that comes from tax havens? My estimate is that up to 18 billion pounds of that might be the result of tax haven activity. I call tax havens secrecy jurisdictions because that's a more accurate term of what they do. A secrecy jurisdiction deliberately creates legislation for the use of people who don't live there. And that legislation is designed to undermine the rules, regulations and laws of the countries where they do really live. What is more, the tax haven deliberately creates a veil of secrecy that makes sure that those people who are using their legislation can't be identified by the country where they live.
People are allowed to spend their money and to invest their money where they choose. So if you want to spend your money by investing it in one of these low-tax financial centres, then who am I, or who is anyone else, to prevent that from happening?
People need secrecy for a number of reasons, or so they say. The first reason, which, for example, a bank or a commercial company would use, was to say to protect its commercial privacy. Well, actually, I don't believe that. If you look at economic theory, markets work at their best when there is the maximum amount of information on what everybody is doing. On that basis, you can decide where best to allocate capital to get the proper, fair allocation of resources, which utilises the world's assets best to create maximum well-being.
How do companies use tax havens? They do things like placing very difficult to value assets, like, for example, intellectual property rights, in tax havens. So what happens is, if you've got a company that's producing something in a developing country, like, let's say, India, and that's where all their staff are employed, that's where all their factories are, that's essentially where they do all their business. The subsidiary that exists in India will then have to trade to get, say, the logo that is then going to be put on the clothes. Now, the problem is, if the logo has been assigned to the Cayman Islands, then the subsidiary in India will effectively have to buy the use of the logo from the subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. And of course, if it's something that's very difficult to value, I mean, who knows how much the logo of Nike is worth, that means that sale between the two subsidiaries means that you can transfer vast sums of money and profits from the countries where these companies are actually operating to tax havens.
You can also do what is called layering of your opacity when you're offshore. So instead of just owning a bank account in your own name, which is the obvious way in which most of us have a bank account, you don't do that. They will help you to set up a trust, and the trust will then own a company, and the company will own the bank account. By putting all these barriers in place, what you can do is hide it in a tax haven, and the chances of being found out are very, very low still.
Tax havens undermine the ability of developing countries to raise their own revenue. In the long term, we want those countries to move away from aid dependence and raise their own revenue to invest in schools and hospitals and the kinds of things that will foster development. But tax haven secrecy undermines that because it allows wealthy individuals, corporates and other nefarious activities to undermine the tax bases of developing countries.
Ordinary taxpayers lose out, and that's in both developed and developing countries. And people who use public services also obviously lose out as a result of tax havens.
Last year, the mining giant Glencore was exposed for corporate tax abuse in Zambia. How did they do it? They inflated costs, they mispriced the export of copper from Zambia to Switzerland, and therefore undermined the revenue mobilisation efforts of Zambia, one of the poorest countries in the world, where life expectancy is in the 40s. The UK is a key player. The majority of the world's tax havens are UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies.
The Crown dependencies, that is Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man. And then the British overseas territories, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, the Turks and Caicos Islands and more. We have a right to legislate for them. This was reviewed extensively in Parliament in a report called the Kilbrandon Report. We can pass laws for them with regard to their international relationships. The UK government does actually interfere in the affairs of our tax havens. The most glaringly obvious example is the Turks and Caicos Islands, where, because corruption got so bad, we simply suspended the government there. Nobody internationally objected. This wasn't an invasion, we were exercising our right.
They are ultimately under British sovereignty, and the British Parliament can make decisions that can definitely affect them. The British government only gets involved if there's some crisis or there's some corruption or something very bad that we need to intervene on.
When you speak to the UK government, they say they don't have influence over those jurisdictions. The reality is that they do.
Out of the London 2009 G20 summit, the G20 agreed that they wanted to really take on tax havens, and they declared as a result of their policies that the era of banking secrecy was over. Now, essentially what they proposed was just that countries need to sign 12 what's called tax information exchange agreements with 12 other countries. And if they did this, then they would not be on the G20 and the OECD's blacklist. Now, what's interesting about this is when this blacklist was first introduced, there were 4 countries on it, and essentially overnight these countries then signed those agreements and were taken off the blacklist. So the fact that no countries essentially were ever really on the blacklist demonstrates just how weak this initiative really ever was.
Jersey, which was one of the earliest people to sign a tax information exchange agreement, nearly a decade ago with the USA in their case, has only exchanged less than 100 pieces of information in a decade. Now they call that full transparency, and I call that absolutely ridiculous measure of opacity. So tax information exchange agreements are about useless in terms of their effectiveness.
I don't believe it's the case that anybody could transfer money over to one of the British territories in order to avoid paying legal taxation elsewhere. There is no question that our Crown dependencies are properly regulated. There isn't any money laundering, as the image of some of these places has been in the past, and they are low tax economies, and that's really the attraction for people to invest money there, because by investing in some of those places you're paying less tax than you would in the United Kingdom.
Tax havens play a key role in facilitating corruption, whether that's Ben Ali, Gaddafi, the Marcos regime in the Philippines. All of those dictators used tax havens to hide their assets, and it's the secrecy that allowed that to occur.
Without tax havens, that corruption, I'm not saying it wouldn't exist. There would be petty corruption. There's petty corruption the world over, which has nothing to do with tax havens. But on the sheer scale that we're seeing it, the absolute downright looting of whole states, that couldn't happen without a tax haven.
It's ridiculous in times of austerity, when the government's having to slash public services left, right and centre, that one of the first things that they're just not seriously addressing is the fact that so much money is lost to the public purse as a result of tax havens.
Christian Aid estimates that developing countries lose more than they receive in aid as a result of tax evasion. Christian Aid suggests that as a result of just 2 forms of corporate tax evasion, developing countries lose $160 billion a year. And to put that in context, the aid budget globally is around $100 billion a year, so it's 1.5 times the global aid budget. There are maybe a few 100,000 people who live in tax havens. There are billions of people who lose out as a result of tax haven activities.
The first thing that somebody could do if they want to take action against tax havens is actually look at their bank. Is your bank Barclays? If your bank is Barclays, then it's got an extraordinary number of tax haven subsidiaries, but that's also true of Royal Bank of Scotland and of Lloyds and so on. So you can move your money into a bank which isn't going to use a tax haven activity and support it. I think that's the first step. Secondly, you can get involved with the campaign to actually tackle tax havens, obviously. And that is people like Christian Aid are doing this, Action Aid are doing this, the Tax Justice Network are doing this, and others are doing this. So you might want to support an organisation that's doing that. Thirdly, if you actually are brave enough, you could, if you have some investments, you could go along to your company's annual general meeting and say, I would like to know which countries you operate in, how many subsidiaries you've got in tax havens and what you do in them.
One of the things that people should be pushing for is for something called country-by-country reporting.
Country-by-country reporting is a new system of accounting. What it simply does is ask that a multinational corporation prepare a profit and loss account. That's a statement of its sales less its costs to give its profit, on which it then pays tax. The statement of those figures for each and every country in which it operates.
Obviously things like this would be reported in the papers, and consumers could then look at companies like that and say, well, most probably they are involved in tax avoidance. I don't support that, therefore I'm going to choose to spend my money buying the goods and services of another company.
It's a risk assessment system that lets us understand better than we can possibly do using existing accounting structures just exactly what the world's multinational corporations are doing, and that's exactly why they hate it.
When we started this work in 2008, we were kind of castigated for being completely idealistic. A few years later, we've got support from the G20, the UN, the IMF, the OECD. This is an emerging agenda that isn't going to go away. There are strong vested interests that we need to counter, but I feel positive that we will make significant progress in the years to come.
In the process of making this film, we attempted to contact both accountants and lawyers that work for all the major accountancy firms and legal firms, which obviously help structure these tax deals. And we also approached ministers in our Crown dependencies, and none of these people were willing to speak to us.